get the conversation going here today. My name is Peter DeToy, as you can see obviously on your screens there. I'm a founder of a consultancy called Future Work IQ, and what we spend our time doing is helping leadership teams to understand the mega trends of the near future and try and prepare for those in order to be able to reinvent their workplaces and stay relevant in the workplace. And what we are spending our time with a lot now is the conversation around climate change with leadership teams, and helping them to improve their digital literacy, etc., and their organization's digital not digital literacy, climate literacy. That's what I meant to say. We were busy with digital literacy prior to to the pandemic and everything, so that's kind of stuck in my brain. But climate literacy is where we are putting our focus now, and so I'm really, really excited to have Natasha Parker with us. Natasha is with an organization called Global Action Plan, and she is the head of Post-Consumerism at Global Action Plan. So, Natasha, what I want us to do before we get into the conversation, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about Global Action Plan. What do they do? And then I'm really interested in hearing about what the head of Post-Consumerism does.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and the first time I've used the LinkedIn Live feature, so that's very exciting just in itself. So Global Action Plan, we are an environmental charity, and we're aiming to help us move towards a world where everyone can enjoy happy and healthy lives, but within the Earth's limits. So we do a lot of research, we do a lot of campaigns, we try and encourage collective action. And our two main areas of work are around working towards a world where we have clean air to breathe, and also the work that I lead, which is around post-consumerism. So what we mean by that essentially is that we currently live in a world where consumerism really is the prevailing cultural norm, as well as our kind of economic norm, in that we are expected to keep buying more and more stuff as a way of kind of working towards a happier, better life. But unfortunately, this is both driving the kind of destruction of our precious resources, leading to being a big driver of climate change, leading to the destruction of nature. So we're going to have to find different ways to chase our happiness. Luckily, the research shows that there are much better ways for us to find happiness and promote our well-being. So very much my role is around helping us think about how do we live well and live good lives, but within the Earth's limits. And we do a lot of research particularly with young people, and looking at how do we shift our culture. And part of that is about getting those conversations going. So that's where I think the article that you saw that I'd written on here, we're very much looking at how do we help people have more conversations about climate, about the way that we're living, about sustainability, because that's the way we're going to help to really kind of shift those cultural norms and help us think about better ways we can live that are within the Earth's limits, but also good for our well-being too.
Thanks, Natasha. So for everybody listening to the conversation, if you go to Natasha's profile on LinkedIn and you scroll, through her posts that you made, you'll see there's an update with a dashhound as a picture for the actual update, and that is in fact the update that caught my attention, and which is why I reached out to Natasha, because I thought that the comments that she discussed there were incredibly important. Before we get into that, I just wanted to ask you, Natasha, you mentioned to me before we went live that prior to Global Action Plan, your interest had been in mental health. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So I've been working for Global Action Plan for about 6.5 years now, very much focusing on our environmental problems. But before that, I worked for mental health charities and for Public Health England, kind of looking at our mental well-being and how do we live better lives. And then I suppose it came to me that, you know, a lot of the things we're told to do to promote our well-being are actually also better for the planet too. And so I was very lucky to kind of move to Global Action Plan, where I could bring those two passions together, to be looking at how do we promote well-being while we're also looking at ways to live more sustainably as well.
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned to everyone, for those of you that joined us a bit late, this is a social audio experience. So you know, as we get into this, you're welcome to raise your hand and join us on stage. That'll be great. I'm seeing a couple of people that I know as well. So I just want to say hello to Joseph and a couple of others. So Natasha, let's just get into this. My first question that I have for you, which I'd like to just get your insights around, is why do you think it's important for us to be talking about climate change?
So I think it is incredibly important, because we need to show that we care. And when we don't talk about it, then we don't really see that other people care as much as perhaps they might do. So at Global Action Plan, we've done a lot of research and we talk a lot about something called the values perception gap. And that's the idea that when asked, most of us will say, yeah, we are very concerned about climate change. We want to live more sustainably. We want a more sustainable world. We want businesses and governments to take more action. But when you ask us what we think other people think, we're not quite as optimistic. We don't think other people care as much as we do ourselves. And then this myth is kind of perpetuated the more that we don't talk about it, because then if we don't talk about it, then other people aren't seeing that we care as much as we do. And this is what you need for political and cultural change. We need to feel a sense of collective action together, that I care and I can trust that other people care and want change too. It makes us bolder, it makes us braver, it makes us able to take more action. We don't have to feel like the slightly odd person who's doing this on our own, and we feel much less alone when we feel that others care too. And if we stay silent and we're not talking about it, and I'm sure we'll get to it, there's all sorts of reasons why we don't talk about it. It can be really difficult, much more difficult than we acknowledge sometimes. But this can just hold us back from not just talking about it, but from taking action too. So that's why we think it's so important that we do get these conversations starting, because that's what's needed to really shift cultural norms and to give those messages to not only each other that we care and we want action, but to governments and to businesses that, you know, we do want change and we want it quickly, and we know how important this is, and we want that to be happening.
So I want to just share something interesting with you, because this made me think of a concept that we have used while helping organizations to be comfortable with digital communication, for example. And one of the things that we encourage, especially leadership teams, to do is to do something called work out loud, which means that you actually need to tell the world, or tell your company, or tell your organization what you're busy working on, because in that act of actually speaking, which is exactly what you said, you can actually then connect with people that you would normally not connect to. I mean, the example I want to use is yourself. You actually took the trouble to write that post on LinkedIn, and as a result of that, we connected, and that's exactly what's needed. If you're not talking and you are not sharing your feelings around this, or your insights around this, then you can't make that connection. And now that the world, the technology that we have, I mean, LinkedIn audio is a classic example of that, and many other platforms, we can now connect as people, which makes talking about this so important. So I want to just ask you a second question around this topic. I know you did allude to this for a second, but In your experience and the research that you have done, what makes it difficult for people sometimes to talk about climate and climate change and what we are facing?
Thanks, Peter. And yeah, just to say on your previous point that yeah, it is really important when we are out there talking out loud and showing our work out loud, as you described it. You never know who you're going to inspire, and you never know who you're going to connect with, which is another reason to be doing it, to be talking about it and talking about all the exciting things that we are doing to take action. But so we did a big piece of research with young people, so with 18 to 24-year-olds, specifically on, what might be like whether they are concerned and talking about climate change, and what might be some of the things that are preventing them from doing so. We found that overwhelmingly, most people do care, and other surveys done with wider groups of adults and young people back this up as well, that when asked, we found that 89% of the young people we spoke to described themselves as being deeply concerned about climate change. So it's not a case of people just don't care. That's why they're not talking. We know that's not the case. We know they do. But they told us that only around a third of them were actually talking to their friends about it. And when we dug into the reasons why that was, what they were telling us was, well, one of the big reasons was they just didn't quite feel confident to do so. They didn't necessarily feel they had enough knowledge to be able to do that confidently. I think, we often in the environmental sector, we can be guilty of talking in a lot of jargon and making it sound quite technical and complicated, which then puts people off. They're worried about talking about it in case they get something wrong and don't have all the facts that they need to. The second thing that was really, really overwhelming was that feeling of, well, I don't know if I can talk about it because I'm not perfect. I'm feeling a bit hypocritical, saying, well, I really like buying fast fashion, and I really, I do like a burger at McDonald's or whatever. So I don't feel I can talk about climate change, and people feeling really worried about being called out for that sense of hypocrisy, particularly on things like social media, where if they're posting about things they care about, but then know that they're their own behavior, their friends know that they like to buy fast fashion, then you might feel less inclined to post something about the damaging environmental impacts of it, for example. So, and I think we all feel that sense of hypocrisy. None of us are perfect. We're all on a journey. And I think that can be true for businesses as well. So, I mean, our research was with young people, but we've been talking a lot recently also about how businesses, when they do talk openly about what they're doing, often open themselves up to accusations of greenwash. Because obviously not all aspects of their work is going to be perfect, and often they do make overstated claims. So it can be tricky for businesses as well, because if they talk about it too much, they are opening themselves up to accusations of hypocrisy. So it affects us all, whether we're individuals or businesses. And then the final thing was about, we don't want to feel judgmental of other people either. And sometimes if we're, as much as we're not perfect, no one else is either. So it can feel a little bit difficult. Like an example someone kind of said to me the other day was around being invited to another hen do in a different city, where they're being asked by their group of friends to go and jump on a short flight to go somewhere, and they're really, they're concerned about climate change and don't want to be getting lots of short flights in a year. And broaching that can be really hard with your friends, because you can feel like you're telling them that they're wrong for what they're doing. So it not only makes us feel hypocritical ourselves, but it can also make us feel like we're actually being a bit judgmental of others, and make us feel like we're being a bit preachy, which, so it can be a minefield, to be honest, Peter. There's so many ways that it can be really challenging for us to talk about.
So if I had to ask you, of those things you mentioned, what would you say came up the most, would you say?
I think the strongest ones were people worrying that they didn't quite know, they didn't quite know their facts well enough,
Okay.
that it feels complicated to talk about. So they don't quite know where to start. And that sense of hypocrisy, I think that's really, really strong, came out really strongly, that people don't want to be called out, and they're worried that they will be. So I think those two things have probably came out the strongest.
So can I ask you, just from your perspective, the question about not having all your facts together, how do you think the general population, or just people in general, can be helped to improve their climate literacy? What do you think it would be at the core of that?
I think, well, first of all, I would say, we don't need to all 100% understand all the science. We don't need to all go and I think for those of us working in the field, we're used to going and reading hundreds of articles and reading the IPCC reports, and we can't expect, people in the general public to do that, and they don't need to. So I think, but programs on TV can be really, really helpful. There's some fantastic, obviously, the kind of David Attenborough documentaries that focus on climate change can be really helpful. There's lots of useful information going around on social media, but I think also helping people feel like they don't have to, really, they don't have to know everything about all the kind of science. They can still be concerned. You can show concern anyway, whether it's about and particularly around things that are impacting our day-to-day lives, is the most powerful way, really. So things like talking about the heat waves that we've had this summer, and how that's made people feel, and whether it's made them feel more worried about the future. And it can be often more important to be talking about how we feel and asking people how they feel about things, rather than kind of testing people's knowledge, if you like. But there is loads of great information out there. But yeah, I think from what we've heard, a lot of young people are getting their information on social media, and from documentaries and TV programs. So Netflix documentaries, things like Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, and also from a lot of people mentioned kind of they watch the David Attenborough documentaries and things, which has helped them feel more confident.
Right. Okay. So that, I think, probably opens up the conversation, because we've started talking about this. How you get over this reluctance to talk about the subject? I mean, what needs to happen, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. Like I've said, there's lots of ways that we can it can feel difficult, and that's where I think in the article that I wrote, that I published on LinkedIn, it's useful to reference things that are happening in our cultural environment. So whether that's where businesses are taking action, things like the example I used was the Greg's vegan sausage roll. I mean, that's a really nice down to earth conversation starter. Is, what do you think about that? Or and we absolutely loved the example this summer of in the UK. eBay sponsored Love Island, and normally the Love Island program, it's incredibly popular. It's one of the most watched TV programs, and normally it's sponsored by a fast fashion brand. And this year they dressed them in pre-loved clothing, which can have such a huge cultural impact. So having things like that, so the media can really help, and businesses can really help by seeing people taking action and talking about climate change in those unexpected places, by unexpected people, by those very relatable role models. So I think we all know that if we see David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg, that they're going to express their concern about climate change. But it's even more powerful when we see it from people we don't expect, when we see it from a Love Island contestant, or a pop star that we didn't know, or a footballer, or a gaming star. And these are the really relatable role models for young people, because what we found in our research was they're not seeing people like them talk about climate change and talk about sustainability in a relatable way, and they're just not seeing their own role models. And we all need to see, which is why we need the most kind of diverse set of people in our media talking about it as possible, because we all need to see people we relate to, and people like ourselves talking about it, taking it seriously, showing their concern, for us to feel comfortable to be able to have those conversations and share ourselves. So I think it's a mixture of, we need to do more to be braver, to just, have those conversations and find stuff that's out there in our cultural landscape that we can just ask people about, rather than feeling like we've got to tell them all the facts and we've got to convince them. So letting go of that need to feel like we've got to get someone on our side and convince them of all the arguments, or that we've got to convince someone to change, letting go of all that, and just, having much more relaxed conversations and putting questions out there, like, what did you think about the Love Islanders wearing pre-love clothes this year? It can be, much more of an interesting, open conversation. It feels much less judgmental. It feels less hypocritical to open conversations in that way, and just be asking those questions of people, of how they feel about things. How did you feel about the heat waves this summer? Rather than trying to tell them and overwhelm them with facts. We don't need to do that. And it can feel quite brave to do that, but we have got to all take that first step and do it more often. I'm very much guilty myself of avoiding the conversation sometimes, depending on who I'm with. So I'm trying to challenge myself to be a bit braver, and raise those conversations. Yeah, so that's a starter.
So I just wanted to say to everybody that's listening, as I mentioned to you a little earlier on at the start of this conversation, this is a social audio experience. So if you want to ask a question or you want to add something to the conversation, all you need to do is just raise your hand. I'll see that here and I'll bring you up on stage. You can unmute yourself and you can ask or comment. We're in this together. It's a conversation that we all need to have. And Natasha and I have just basically seeded the conversation. Natasha, I wanted to just say something to you regarding a sort of trend that I've seen, and I'm not sure, maybe you've seen this too. In years gone by, the whole conversation around climate change, etc., was sort of confined to academic circles. I'm talking about way back, right? But now, if you take what's happened in 2022, the summer that we've just experienced in the Northern Hemisphere has been pretty terrifying, and hundreds of millions of people have had, maybe for the first time, a real frightening experience with regards to a climate that has shifted. And so now what started to happen is that vast numbers of people are beginning to say, hey, what's actually going on here? Something is not what it used to be. And the reason for that, of course, is, if you start in Japan, they've experienced heat waves. China has experienced a crazy situation with about 70 or more days of just consistent heat. Pakistan and India have experienced the same, so has Europe, so has the UK. And now in the US, on the West Coast, they're experiencing unusual events related to heat, etc. So do you think that what's going to happen is, as more and more people begin to actually have this shift that was predicted or projected by scientists for decades, now beginning to experience it, do you think that that's going to make the conversation easier to have?
Well, sadly, yes, it should, hopefully, because I think, in talking about climate change previously, one of the mistakes that's been made is to talk about it as something far away in the future, both far away in the future and often far away geographically from us, wherever we are. And so I think it actually is talking about the impacts that we're feeling right here, right now, and particularly the ones closer to home, but also we are seeing the images of the floods in Pakistan, and just how, and it's good to see that that is being reported as linked to climate change. These natural disasters are not always necessarily talked about in that way, and it's good to see that the media is more and more reporting them as climate related. And I think that's definitely helping to move it up the agenda. The risk is, though, that there's always, I mean, we're just living at a time where there's so many crises going on at once. Everything's reported in the news as another crisis. And, we're very much feeling in the midst of a cost of living crisis right now. There's the war in Ukraine. So there's always a risk of climate and sustainability kind of falling down the agenda a little bit, but it's not going to go away, and we're going to repeatedly, unfortunately and very sadly, have more and more of these examples. That yeah, and so it is. We need to talk about them, and we need to talk about how we feel about them, and we need to talk about. We need to make sure that they are always spoken about in the context of a changing climate and the urgency to reduce our emissions and to do things differently, both as communities, as businesses, as governments, and use them as examples of the need to put more and more pressure for us all to change as quickly as possible, because the window is closing for us to really take the action that's needed. And unless we do take that action, these are just going to become more frequent and more often, and more intense. So absolutely, sadly, we are seeing the impacts and feeling them much more and more each year. And yes, this should be a way for us to bring this into conversation more and more, because it's going to be part of our day-to-day reality.
Can I ask you something else that I just would love to hear your thoughts on? Because I'm sure this must have come up, in talking about the subject and the research that you folk have done on this. But when an individual ups their climate literacy, one of the first things that happen is they begin to understand the enormity of the task ahead.
Yeah.
We quite literally have to re-engineer basically the entire global economy. We have to re-engineer the way we show up. We have to re-engineer the way we move around. It is quite literally a monumental task. Now, the danger sometimes, and I assume that this could have come across in some of the research that you did, when that reality dawns on someone as to the enormity of this, could that not create a situation where a person is overwhelmed, and as a result of the overwhelm actually decide that there's nothing to do, and you almost accept your fate, that we are spiraling out of control?
Absolutely. I mean, it is overwhelming, and we can all feel overwhelmed at times. And almost the greater your understanding and the greater that you understand what needs to happen, the more overwhelming it can feel. But that's why we need to not focus on just individual action and focus on collective action, and us as feeling as part of something bigger than ourselves, taking action together. So, yeah, in research we've done with young people, a different set of research actually we've just completed recently with the University of Edinburgh, interviewing young people about how they feel about the future, and how they feel about the climate crisis. And for many of them, they're feeling concerned and they're feeling overwhelmed, and they're finding it very difficult to imagine a positive future, which is, a terribly sad state of affairs to be in. And we need to get creative. We need to be imagining, well, what to help us, get move beyond that feeling of overwhelmedness and feel hopeful and start taking action. We also need to imagine, well, how could the world be better? What could be some of the positive ways that the world could be impacted if we we do transform our economy, and actually put people and planet above profit? How might that make the world better in all sorts of ways for all sorts of different issues? So from inequality, reducing inequality, making sure everybody's got the basics and the essentials met in their lives because we're distributing resources more fairly. There are all sorts of ways that the world can be better if we take action. So that can be a way to help us feel more hopeful. And secondly, about not putting the onus on the individual to change, but helping people take action together. So we do a lot of work in schools, for example, and we very much focus on helping young people see other young people taking action and taking action together on things they care about and talking to each other about it. So it's both kind of closing what I was talking about earlier, that values perception gap of feeling like I care, but actually because other people care too, I feel this is doable. So I think always reminding people that other people care too. We're tackling this together. You're not alone. That in our messaging can really help people to feel slightly less overwhelmed, and that it's not impossible to change the world, because actually if we come at it together, it's much more doable.
Great. So we've got Joseph and Mohammed who's raised their hands to come up on stage. So we'll take them one at a time. So Joseph, if you could just unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Yeah, just a comment, really. I mean, I think I agree with absolutely every single word that Natasha has said today, which is great. I just wanted to add one kind of small detail into this, and I think this where it comes down to like customers and colleagues and the power of connection between individual people who know one another. In the recent Yale climate communication study, they were looking at that kind of perception gap that Natasha referred to earlier on. And they were trying to figure out why is it that there are so many people who kind of in principle are happy to take action, but in practice do not. And one of the things that they discovered is that people need to be asked, and more importantly, they need to be asked by somebody who they trust and they like. And so it doesn't really, NGOs, not good enough. Politicians, not good enough. Celebrities, not good enough. People need to be asked to take action, to be essentially given permission to take action by people that they like. And that, I think, is where we can all have real impact in our kind of day-to-day conversations. And one little framework that I just leave you with that I like to use in these conversations is the 5 stages of grief, which I'm sure many of you know, and it works so nicely in the context of climate. So we've got those 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And if you keep those in mind when you're having a conversation with somebody, you can kind of figure out where they're coming from in the conversation and tailor your responses. Are they coming from a place of denial? There's a particular type of response. Are they coming from a place of depression? A particular type of response. So it's a really useful framework for kind of figuring out where people are at and realizing that everyone's at a different stage and each stage requires a different kind of conversation. And of course, that implies you've got to figure out where you are yourself on those 5 stages. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Do stay with us here. You can go back on mute if you like. Natasha, what are your observations about what Joseph just said there?
Yeah, I think yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting about a lot of us don't take as much action as we should, and it's I think that it's a very important point about like being asked by people we trust and having that permission. So and that's a lot of the work we do at Global Action Plan, is really just trying to make it feel normal that these actions are not something we're trying to do in isolation, but something that we're doing with others. So hence a lot of the work we do with young people is about getting them to do it together, so it feels like they've got permission and it feels like they're doing it with people they like rather than doing it alone. And I think that the concept of the 5 stages of grief is really interesting as well, that everyone's at different stages. And I think it's important to remember that in terms of action as well. We're all at different stages on our journey. So at Global Action Plan, we often talk about, we're on a journey and we all have a different role to play. We don't, it's not necessarily about everybody doing everything. It's about what have you got to offer in your unique job or your with your unique personality or your unique skills. What can you bring? Because not everyone is going to be a Greta Thunberg who can get up on stage and speak very eloquently. That's just not everyone's skill, and not everyone has to do that. But you might be a great organizer, or you might be I don't know, great at cooking, and actually your thing is to inspire people to cook more plant-based food, or whatever it is. It's using your skill in the world to take that out there. We don't all have to be completely perfect in what we do, and it's unrealistic to expect people to be. And we're all on a journey, so we and I think that's quite a nice question to put out to people, like if in your organization and things, to start conversations, is what are you already doing? Where are people at? It's quite interesting to know. And instead of encouraging here's 10 things you can do, it's like, well, what's one more thing you could add to the things you're already doing, and help people feel quite proud of what they're doing, rather than guilty for the things that they're not doing.
Thank you. Mohammed has been waiting patiently. If you could just unmute and ask your question or comment, Mohammed.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to mention, because it's a very interesting topic that you have, how to start a climate conversation with customers and colleagues. And can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thanks. So what my view is, I just read a couple of days ago about Selfridges. That's a huge store in the UK, and they are doing something like they are trying to make 50% of their transactions resale or repair or something like this, and they are communicating about it. And similarly, I was reading today about Tecton, that they are doing something with a tool that's mainly for sales, but it's giving a perspective to the climate, because whoever is using this tool can see that, okay, how much impact am I creating with my purchases? But what I see that many businesses, they lack this perspective. They don't talk about themselves as the solution, where they are actually part of solution. And if you may allow, I just read about future work. I think what you are doing is great. If you are helping people create offices in cloud, it means you are eliminating actually a lot of CO2. They say that Zoom has eliminated more CO2 than any EV company, just because they eliminated the need of transport and the need to transport from point A to B. So what I really, really see in my profession, that there are many businesses who are who's facing the challenge that they are unable to start the climate conversation. And I don't know why is it so. If you could guide me, why is it so? Anyone could help me with this?
Right, thank you for those observations. Natasha, from your experience with businesses?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead. Natasha, you still with us? So while Natasha is
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can, absolutely.
Yes, Natasha, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, well, I think it would be an interesting research to undertake, wouldn't it? To go out and ask businesses what's stopping them from talking about sustainability and climate more. I think you might get slightly different answers from different types of businesses. I think there possibly is something around they're just not thinking in that mindset always, particularly maybe people in marketing. You have your kind of sustainability and ESG department and people working on that, and that not, whereas people in the kind of marketing communications are not always necessarily thinking through that kind of framework. Also the fear of accusations of greenwashing, if they're or not doing enough, because they're not, obviously not. All businesses have further to go. So I think it would be great if we could encourage businesses to be very open about the journey that they're on and where they're at in that journey, and that this is what we're working on at the moment, and we want to do more, and here's our ambitions. And we just need to keep going, and we just need to keep talking about it, and we need businesses to be talking about it openly about what they're doing, because it can be very inspiring, and it can give us hope that that if we're seeing them do more, even if we know that there's so much more they could do. We don't want them to stop talking about it, and we don't want them to stop trying. So it's kind of navigating that line of knowing that it's not going to be enough and knowing you are going to face criticism, and that's okay. That keeps things moving forward, but also acknowledging and giving each other space, both as individuals and as businesses, that we're on a journey. We need to just keep moving forward and keep going, and keep talking about what we're doing. But yeah, I think it would be. I saw the example of Selfridges. Thought that was brilliant, really interesting, and hopefully very inspiring to other retailers to try and move in that direction as well, to have more resale and more repair. Hopefully that will become a big trend over the next 10 years of pushing up kind of pre-loved and repairing and reusing and having a more circular economy. So yeah, the more businesses are doing and pushing those boundaries forward, the more it's going to inspire others to keep up. So all great stuff.
So I want to just add on to what you just said there, Natasha. Mohammed, you know what my experience has been? A little earlier, I don't know if you were with us when I was talking about how in the past, the climate conversation was sort of an academic one, where it was in academia at some university where, a group of researchers were doing work around the topic. But now, as a result of the lived experience that hundreds of millions of people have had, the conversation has suddenly become mainstream. You don't have to be a scientist to know that you've experienced a heat wave and ask yourself, like, where's this coming from? So, you know what I've seen happen with companies? Many organizations in the past have had like a sort of a little sustainability department. And they've almost created the sustainability department so they can tick off a box, and the conversation around what needs to happen, etc., has been confined to that department, but in essence hasn't really permeated throughout the organization. Whereas now, where we've got to, as a result of what we need to do as a collective, is that we've got to the point where climate and everything related to climate and what we can do to mitigate against making this worse, or what we can do to adapt to the new normal, if you want to call it that, that conversation needs to happen at every decision-making point inside an organization. So in other words, this is no longer a point where it's okay for the sustainability department to talk about that and everybody says, yeah, okay, we've heard you, now we'll just carry on as normal. That's actually not the case anymore. And I think what's going to happen is this, we speak a lot about climate literacy, as I mentioned earlier, but I think climate literacy is going to permeate all the organizations. And everybody is going to be talking about it, just like we are today. Everybody has become digitally literate that is in a modern workplace. You've become digitally fluent because you can, do all these things with the technologies that help us to work from anywhere. It's that same kind of thing will actually happen around literacy related to the climate and what we can do about that, throughout the organization. It's just my thought on that. Okay, so any comments further from yourselves, Joseph and Mohammed, before we hand over to Natasha just for a concluding comment or two around the topic that we had?
Yeah, Peter, I mean, I think everything you're saying is absolutely true. And I think the great example of this that's really been hitting the headlines, like in the past 6 to 12 months, would have been Deloitte. In the past, they've been having those conversations in reasonably kind of siloed fashion. And they took, and I think there was some insane number of global staff. I think it was like 330,000 or some nutty figure like that. Every single staff member of Deloitte was given some level of climate literacy training. It's a horizontal across the whole organization. And as you say, I'm very sure it will be a horizontal across the whole economy. I think there will be no green economy in the future because the whole economy will be green.
Right. Okay. So in your case, it'll be exciting for you to be able to have worked yourself out of what you do, which is great. And the same applies to me, really. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And Natasha, I know we said that we would do 1 hour 45 roundabout there, and I just want to thank both Joseph and Mohammed for being willing to come up and ask your questions and your observations. Social audio, for those of you that participate in this in future, is what this is all about. It's about being able to have a conversation together on a topic. Yes, there may be a theme, but you can bring your expertise and your ideas to this, which makes for a very rich conversation. So, Natasha, if you think of yourself, if you had a magic wand, and you could just wave that magic wand, what would you like to see around this topic that we've had? In other words, starting conversations with colleagues and with customers around climate. What would you like to see? What would be a perfect world for you around this topic?
Oh, that's a huge question. I don't know if this would make a perfect world, but if there's one thing that would be a good step in the right direction, would be for us to all let go of that sense of hypocrisy, of just kind of knowing that none of us are perfect. We've got to start where we're at, and for everyone to just, I think as the last comment was about, is that we've got to look at everything through the lens of climate and sustainability. And we've got to start from where we're at to make as much progress as possible. And if we all feel we have to be perfect for us to talk out loud about this, then we're not going to get anywhere. We've got to really just accept where we are, accept that we're on a journey, absolutely understand the urgency and the importance, and drive as much change as we all can, both as individuals, in our roles, in our jobs, as citizens, in the way that we engage with the wider world, and in the way that we communicate through the media as well. Doing as much as we possibly can. And if we could just kind of get rid of that fear of, oh God, I can't really talk about it because I'm not perfect or I'm not doing enough, then I think that would help. It would help us take a big leap forward.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to say to everybody, thank you for joining us for this conversation. I hope it was insightful. My recommendation to you is reach out to Natasha, connect with her on LinkedIn if you haven't done so already. Because the more connected our networks are that discuss these topics, the better it's going to be for everybody. So I just want to thank everybody for being with us. Thank Natasha especially for her time, and we will chat again all soon. Have a great Wednesday.
Thanks, Peter.